Sir, I am not asking again. Get out of that seat. The words cut through the first-class cabin so cleanly that even the soft hum of the air system seemed to disappear. Marcus Bennett looked up from seat 2A and found Richard Coleman standing in the aisle, one hand resting against the seat back across from him. His expression already settled into the certainty of a man who believed the conversation should have ended before it began. Marcus did not raise his voice. He reached into the inside pocket of his charcoal jacket, removed his boarding pass, and held it out. Seat 2A, he said. You can verify it. Richard barely glanced at the screen. There is an issue with this reservation. Then verify the reservation. A few passengers turned toward them. Someone farther back lifted a phone. Marcus noticed the movement in the dark reflection of the window, but kept his eyes on Richard. Outside, evening rain traced silver lines across the glass while ground vehicles moved beneath the cold white lights of the runway. Richard exhaled through his nose. We have already verified what we need to verify. Marcus looked at the boarding pass still glowing in his hand. His name was there. The flight number was there. Seat 2A was there. Then tell me what is wrong. Richard's jaw tightened. You need to leave the aircraft while we resolve the issue. Across the aisle, a white businessman in his 60s shifted uncomfortably. 10 minutes earlier, Marcus had watched airline staff spend several patient minutes correcting that man's duplicate reservation without asking him to surrender his seat. They had apologized twice. They had brought him water. Now Richard was speaking to Marcus as though every additional question were an act of defiance. Marcus slowly locked his phone and placed it beside his leather portfolio. Is my ticket invalid? I said there is an issue. That is not what I asked. Near the front galley, a young flight attendant named Emily Carter stared at a tablet, then looked toward Richard. Mr. Coleman, she said carefully, the passenger record is still updating. I think we should wait until the synchronization finishes. Richard did not turn around. We are already behind schedule. Emily hesitated, but his boarding pass matches the seat. Several passengers were openly watching now. Marcus could feel their attention without looking at them. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee, leather, and rain carried in on coats. Somewhere behind him, a seat belt buckle clicked. Richard lowered his voice, but the impatience remained. Sir, collect your belongings. Marcus looked past him toward Emily. Her face carried the expression of someone who knew something was wrong, but had not yet decided how hard she was willing to say it. Then Marcus looked back at Richard. You have my name. You have my boarding pass. You have an employee telling you the system is still updating. What exactly are you verifying by removing me? Richard's face hardened. Do not make this more difficult than it needs to be. Marcus remained completely still. He had spent 30 years in rooms where powerful people mistook calmness for weakness and silence for surrender. He knew the temptation to announce who he was, to mention the meeting scheduled for the following morning, or to explain that people far above Richard's position had spent 6 months waiting for Marcus Bennett's signature. He did none of those things. A title should never be the price of basic dignity. Marcus picked up his boarding pass and held it between 2 fingers. I will ask you one question, he said quietly. Richard waited. Marcus glanced once toward the white passenger whose reservation problem had been handled with patience, then returned his gaze to the man standing over him. Did you check the ticket, or did you check me? 40 minutes earlier, Marcus Bennett had entered the terminal without an assistant, a security detail, or anyone carrying his luggage. He preferred traveling that way when he could. At 49, he had spent enough years moving through private conference rooms and executive lounges to understand how quickly people changed when they recognized power. Sometimes anonymity offered something more valuable than comfort. It showed him who people were before they knew who he was. Rain tapped against the enormous terminal windows as Marcus walked toward the Aurelius Air Lounge, with one leather portfolio in his left hand and his phone vibrating inside his jacket. He checked the screen without slowing. David Ross, his general counsel, had sent another message about the closing scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. 6 months of negotiations had reached their final 24 hours. Hundreds of lawyers, bankers, engineers, and government advisors had worked through thousands of pages of agreements connecting aviation infrastructure, logistics networks, airport development, and long-term financing. The total strategic transaction was valued at $52 billion. Marcus had insisted on reviewing the final conditions personally before authorizing his signature. His phone vibrated again. This time it was David calling. Marcus stopped near a window overlooking the rain-darkened runway. "Tell me something good," Marcus said. "Everything is ready on our side," David replied. Aurelius approved the final language. "We only need your authorization tomorrow morning." Marcus watched an aircraft move slowly through the wet darkness. "And the operational protections?" "Included exactly as requested." "Employee commitments?" "Included." Marcus nodded. "Then we review once more in the morning." David laughed softly. "You have already reviewed it 4 times. That is why you sleep better." "I would sleep better if you traveled with your staff." Marcus smiled. "I am taking a 90-minute flight, David, not crossing an ocean." After ending the call, he placed the phone back inside his jacket and continued toward the gate. Nothing about him announced $52 billion. His charcoal jacket was expensive but understated. His shoes carried a few drops of rain from the terminal entrance. He wore no visible security badge and no company pin. At the gate, an agent scanned his boarding pass. A red message flashed briefly on her screen. She frowned, tapped several keys, then scanned it again. The light turned green. "You are all set, Mr. Bennett. Seat 2A. Marcus thanked her and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, Emily Carter greeted him with a professional smile and directed him toward first class. Marcus found 2A, placed his portfolio beneath the seat in front of him, and settled beside the window. Across the aisle, a white businessman was speaking with another employee about a duplicate reservation. The employee listened patiently, checked 2 screens, apologized for the inconvenience, and assured him that nobody would move him until the system finished updating. Marcus barely noticed. He opened a document on his phone and began reviewing tomorrow's final meeting notes. Then Emily approached the front galley and quietly showed her tablet to Richard Coleman. Marcus heard only fragments. Equipment change. Synchronization delay. Passenger records. Richard looked toward the cabin. His eyes passed over the white businessman, then stopped on Marcus. A few minutes later, Richard walked directly toward seat 2A. Marcus looked up, expecting a routine question. He did not yet know that the boarding system had created nearly identical verification flags on 2 reservations. He did not know that one passenger would be given patience while the other would be treated as a problem. And Richard had no idea that the quiet black man sitting by the rain-streaked window was carrying the final authority over the largest strategic transaction in his airline's history. Richard did not answer Marcus's question. Instead, he looked toward the front of the cabin as though the conversation had become an operational inconvenience rather than a question about fairness. "The system flagged your reservation," he said. "We need you to step off the aircraft while we sort it out." Marcus held up the boarding pass again. The system also flagged another reservation across the aisle. Richard's eyes shifted briefly toward the white businessman, who was now sitting comfortably with a glass of water beside him. "That situation is different." "How?" Richard's silence lasted half a second too long. Marcus noticed. So did Emily. She stood near the galley with her tablet pressed against her uniform, watching the exchange with growing concern. "Mr. Coleman," she said, "both records were affected by the aircraft change. The synchronization is still processing." Richard turned toward her. "And we are now 14 minutes behind schedule." "I understand, but his seat assignment is confirmed on the boarding pass. The manifest is what matters." Emily looked down at her tablet. "The manifest is updating." Marcus leaned back slightly and studied Richard. He had seen this pattern before, although rarely with so many witnesses. A decision was made quickly. Then every new fact became something to defend against rather than something to consider. Richard was no longer investigating whether Marcus belonged in seat 2A. He was protecting the certainty with which he had decided that Marcus did not. Across the aisle, the white businessman cleared his throat. "For what it is worth," he said, "my reservation had the same problem." Richard offered him a tight professional smile. "Your situation has been resolved, sir." Marcus looked at the man's boarding pass resting on the armrest. "Was he asked to leave the aircraft while you resolved it?" Richard's expression hardened. "This is not a debate. It became one when you created 2 standards for the same problem." A low murmur moved through the cabin. Marcus heard the soft sound of another phone beginning to record. Richard glanced around and seemed to become more determined rather than more careful. "Mr. Bennett, you can leave voluntarily while we verify your reservation, or I can request assistance." Marcus looked at Emily. "Is my boarding pass legitimate?" Emily hesitated only because Richard was watching her. Then she answered, "Yes, sir. The boarding pass is legitimate. Is seat 2A assigned to another passenger?" She checked the tablet. Not according to the current cabin record. Richard stepped closer to her. "Emily, return to your boarding duties." She remained still for a moment, then moved toward the galley, but her eyes stayed on Marcus. Marcus turned back toward the window. Rainwater trembled against the glass under the bright airport lights. His phone vibrated once beside his portfolio. Probably David. Probably another question about tomorrow's closing. Marcus ignored it. "You know what is interesting?" he said quietly. Richard waited. "The gentleman across from me was treated like a customer with a technical problem. I was treated like the technical problem." Richard's face tightened. "You are making assumptions about my intentions." Marcus looked directly at him. "I am describing your actions." The distinction settled heavily between them. Richard looked toward the front door, where two airport security officers had appeared and were waiting for instructions. They did not approach Marcus. They simply stood near the entrance, calm and professional. Emily returned quickly, holding her tablet. "Mr. Coleman, the synchronization is almost complete. Give me 2 minutes." Richard looked at the cabin clock. "We do not have 2 minutes." Marcus slowly reached beneath the seat and lifted his leather portfolio onto his lap. He understood then that this was no longer about a computer error. The error could be corrected. Richard simply did not want to be corrected with it. Marcus looked at the two officers, then at the passengers watching from behind their screens. Finally, he looked at Emily. "Keep the record," he said quietly. "Every timestamp. Every update." Richard frowned. "Why?" Marcus stood without answering, his expression calm as he buttoned his charcoal jacket. He had not decided what would happen next. But somewhere inside the airline's computer system, the truth was still loading, and unlike the people in the cabin, it had no reason to care who Marcus Bennett appeared to be. Marcus rose from seat 2A without argument, and the movement seemed to release a breath the entire cabin had been holding. He placed his phone inside his jacket, lifted the leather portfolio from his lap, and checked the seat pocket once before stepping into the aisle. Richard moved aside, his expression carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed compliance had proven him right. Marcus noticed it, but said nothing. The two security officers near the aircraft door remained several feet away. Neither touched him. Neither needed to. Marcus walked toward them under his own power while the cold cabin lights reflected across the polished overhead bins. Phones followed him from both sides of the aisle. Some passengers watched openly. Others lowered their eyes when Marcus looked in their direction. The white businessman across from seat 2A stood halfway from his chair. "This is not right," he said. Richard turned toward him. "Please remain seated, sir." The man looked at Marcus. "They gave me time to fix the exact same problem." Marcus stopped for only a second. "I know." His voice carried no accusation toward the passenger. Then he continued forward. Emily stood near the galley holding her tablet against her chest. Her face had lost its professional calm. "Mr. Bennett," she said quietly, "I am still checking the record." Marcus met her eyes. "Do not delete anything." "I will not." Richard stepped between them. "Emily, we need to close the door." She looked at him. "The system is almost finished." "Then finish after departure." Marcus heard the words clearly. So did several passengers nearest the front. He paused at the aircraft door and looked back toward the cabin. Seat 2A was visible beneath the reading light, empty now except for the folded blanket he had never touched. Richard followed his gaze. "Your reservation can be handled at the gate." Marcus turned toward him. "And if the system confirms I was right?" Richard hesitated. "Customer service will assist you." Marcus gave a small nod, as though the answer had confirmed something more important than the reservation itself. "That was not my question." He stepped onto the jet bridge. The temperature changed immediately. The air was cooler there, carrying the faint smell of rain and aircraft fuel from outside. His shoes made soft sounds against the metal floor as he walked toward the terminal with one security officer several steps behind, present only to ensure the situation remained orderly. Marcus did not hurry. He did not turn toward the phone still recording through the open aircraft door. At the gate, a few waiting passengers looked up as he emerged. The agent who had scanned his boarding pass 40 minutes earlier recognized him immediately. "Mr. Bennett?" Her eyes moved toward the aircraft, confused. "Why are you back here?" Marcus placed his boarding pass on the counter. "I was told my reservation could not be verified." The agent frowned, and entered his name. That does not make sense. I cleared the flag before you boarded. Marcus watched her face change as she opened the record. Your ticket is valid, she said. Seat 2A is confirmed. Behind Marcus, Emily hurried from the jet bridge with her tablet in hand. The synchronization finished, she said, slightly out of breath. She looked directly at Richard, who had followed her to the doorway. Mr. Bennett was correctly assigned to 2A the entire time. The gate area became strangely quiet. Marcus looked through the open doorway toward the aircraft. Is someone else assigned to the seat? Emily shook her head. No, sir. Richard checked his watch. We need to depart. Marcus stared at him for a moment. So you removed a paying passenger from a valid seat that nobody else needed. Richard's expression tightened. We acted on the information available at the time. Emily looked down at her tablet. The information was available before he left the aircraft. Richard said nothing. Marcus picked up his boarding pass from the counter. The paper felt almost weightless between his fingers. Behind the glass, rain continued falling across the runway. A boarding door alarm sounded softly, warning that departure procedures were beginning. Marcus looked at Emily. Keep the record, he repeated. Then he looked toward seat 2A one final time through the open aircraft doorway. Within minutes, the plane would leave without him. The seat would remain empty all the way to its destination, a silent space proving that none of this had ever been necessary. The boarding door closed before Marcus reached the row of empty seats facing the gate windows. Through the glass, rain softened the runway lights into long streaks of white and amber. He sat down, placed his leather portfolio beside him, and watched the jet bridge begin to pull away from the aircraft. There was no dramatic announcement. No manager came running after him. The plane simply prepared to leave, carrying more than 100 passengers and one empty first-class seat that had never needed to be empty. Marcus rested his boarding pass on his knee. Seat 2A. Confirmed. Valid. Paid. The facts had arrived too late only because one man had decided not to wait for them. His phone vibrated again. David Ross. Marcus let it ring once before answering. Marcus, where are you? The car service says your flight should be leaving now. Marcus watched the aircraft begin its slow movement away from the gate. It is. Silence came through the phone. Without you. Without me. David's voice changed immediately. What happened? Marcus looked across the terminal. A maintenance worker pushed a cart beneath fluorescent lights. A mother tied her son's shoe near a charging station. Life continued with the ordinary indifference of an airport where thousands of private frustrations disappeared every day. There was a reservation issue, Marcus said. The issue was resolved. They removed me anyway. David was quiet for a moment. Which airline? Marcus almost smiled at the question. You know which airline. This time the silence lasted longer. Aurelius? Yes. The same Aurelius whose closing documents are sitting on my desk? Marcus leaned back against the chair. The same one. David began speaking faster. Do not say anything publicly. Do not contact their legal department. I need the flight number, names, timestamps, everything you remember. David. His general counsel stopped. I am not calling you to start a war. Then why are you calling me? Marcus looked through the rain-streaked window as the aircraft turned toward the taxiway. Somewhere inside it, Emily still had the electronic record. Somewhere near the front, Richard was probably telling himself that he had protected the schedule. Marcus thought about the white passenger who had been given time, explanations, and patience. Then he thought about the question Richard had never answered. Because tomorrow morning I am supposed to sign an agreement that ties my company to theirs for decades. David exhaled slowly. What do you want me to do? Marcus did not answer immediately. Anger would have been easier. Anger was fast. It demanded something now. Marcus had learned that the decisions with the greatest consequences often arrived in quieter voices. Freeze the Aurelius closing until I personally authorize otherwise. David did not respond for several seconds. Marcus, that transaction is valued at $52 billion. I know what it is worth. The board will ask why. Marcus watched the aircraft disappear behind a curtain of rain. Tell them we discovered an unresolved operational risk. David understood him well enough not to ask whether Marcus was joking. Effective when? Immediately. Marcus ended the call and lowered the phone to his lap. The conversation had taken less than a minute. No threats. No raised voice. No demand for revenge. Just a decision. Several seats away, A college-aged passenger who had been near the gate held a phone loosely in one hand. Marcus did not notice that the young man had recorded part of the earlier exchange through the aircraft doorway. He did not know that another passenger on board had captured the difference between how the two reservation problems were handled. Marcus only knew that the airline had shown him something no financial report could measure. Tomorrow's agreement was supposed to be built on trust. Tonight, beneath the cold terminal lights, trust had become the one thing Aurelius Air could no longer assume it had. By the time Aurelius Flight 417 reached cruising altitude, Seat 2A was still empty. Emily Carter noticed it every time she passed through first class. The reading light above the seat remained on, casting a pale circle across untouched leather. Richard had told the crew to continue service as normal, but nothing about the evening felt normal anymore. Emily carried a tray of drinks down the aisle while replaying the sequence in her mind. The boarding pass had matched. The gate agent had cleared the original flag. The synchronization had confirmed the assignment. She had said so before departure. None of it had changed the decision. When she returned to the galley, she opened the passenger record again and began taking careful notes. She recorded the time Marcus boarded, the moment the verification flag appeared, the system update, her conversation with Richard, and the final confirmation that Seat 2A belonged to Marcus Bennett. She did not know why Marcus had asked her to preserve everything. She only knew that he had asked without anger, and somehow that made the request feel more important. Richard entered the galley several minutes later. "What are you doing?" "Completing the incident report. Customer service can handle that after landing." Emily kept typing. "He asked us to preserve the record." Richard gave her a tired look. "Passengers ask for things when they are upset." Emily stopped and looked toward the empty seat beyond the curtain. He was not upset. Richard followed her gaze. "That does not mean we made the wrong decision. The system says we did." His expression tightened. The system was unclear when the decision was made. Emily turned the tablet toward him. The gate agent cleared his ticket before boarding. The update confirmed it before the door closed. And nobody else was assigned to his seat. For the first time, Richard had no immediate answer. The engines filled the silence between them. Finally, he said, "Document the facts and leave your opinion out of it." Emily looked back at the screen. The facts are the problem. Nearly 1,000 miles away, David Ross was standing in his home office when Marcus's instruction reached the transaction team. Within minutes, attorneys who had expected a quiet final review were back on conference calls. Secure messages moved between Bennett Global Infrastructure's legal department, investment committee, and outside counsel. At 9:18 that evening, Aurelius Air received formal notice that the closing process had been suspended pending further authorization. No accusation appeared in the notice. Marcus's name appeared only where it always had, as the executive whose approval was required to proceed. At Aurelius headquarters, the message reached senior leadership after most employees had gone home. The first person to understand the seriousness of it was Chief Financial Officer Daniel Price. He read the notice twice, then called the general counsel. "Why did Bennett freeze the closing?" "We do not know. The final documents were approved this afternoon. Something changed tonight." Daniel looked at the transaction summary glowing on his monitor. $52 billion in planned financing, infrastructure commitments, fleet modernization, and long-term partnerships now sat behind one word: suspended. "Find out what changed," he said. Back on Flight 417, Emily closed her report and saved a separate copy through the airline's protected incident system. Then she walked through first class once more. The white businessman across the aisle looked toward the empty seat. "He should still be sitting there," he said quietly. Emily did not answer. She only reached up and switched off the reading light above 2A. The seat disappeared into the dim cabin, but the record of what had happened was no longer disappearing with it. Marcus spent the night in an airport hotel less than half a mile from the terminal, but sleep never really came. By 6:30 the next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the city beneath a washed gray sky. He sat near the hotel window with untouched coffee beside him while his laptop displayed the final Aurelius transaction documents. $52 billion appeared across hundreds of pages as projections, financing structures, infrastructure commitments, and future revenue. Yet Marcus kept thinking about something that had no column in any financial model: the difference between patience and suspicion. At 7:12, David called. "You need to see something." Marcus opened the secure link David sent him. The first video had been recorded from several rows behind first class. It showed Richard standing over seat 2A while Marcus held up his boarding pass. The second came from the gate area and captured Emily confirming that the ticket was valid before the aircraft departed. Neither video showed the entire incident, but together they showed enough. They are spreading, David said. Not publicly yet, but employees have started sharing them internally. Aurelius leadership is asking questions. Marcus closed the video. Good. David sounded surprised. Good. They should ask questions before they call me. At Aurelius headquarters, those questions were already moving upward. Daniel Price had arrived before sunrise and gathered the legal, operations, and customer experience teams inside a conference room overlooking downtown. Richard joined remotely after Flight 417 landed. His face appeared on the large wall screen, tired and defensive. We had a manifest discrepancy, he explained. The passenger refused to cooperate with the verification process. Emily, seated in a smaller room at the destination airport, heard the statement through her headset. She looked down at her notes. That is not accurate, she said. The conference room went silent. Richard stared through the screen. Emily continued. Mr. Bennett provided his boarding pass immediately. He answered every question. He agreed to leave without creating a disturbance. The reservation was confirmed before departure. Daniel leaned toward the camera. Mr. Bennett? Something in his voice changed. What was the passenger's full name? Emily checked the report, even though she remembered perfectly. Marcus Bennett. Daniel stopped moving. Across the table, Aurelius' general counsel slowly turned toward him. Marcus Bennett? Richard frowned. Yes. What? Daniel opened the transaction file on his laptop. A professional photograph appeared beside a short executive biography. He rotated the screen toward the others. The same calm face from the passenger video looked back at them. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Richard leaned closer to his camera. Who is he? Daniel's answer came quietly. He is the chairman and chief executive officer of Bennett Global Infrastructure. Richard still looked confused. The general counsel finished the explanation. And Bennett Global controls the final authorization required for the transaction we were supposed to close this morning. Richard's face lost its color. Daniel looked again at the suspended closing notice. Suddenly the timing was no longer mysterious. The $52 billion agreement had stopped moving less than an hour after Marcus Bennett was removed from seat 2A. Richard began to speak. If I had known who he was. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. Daniel looked directly at the screen. That sentence is exactly the problem. Hundreds of miles away, Marcus stood from the hotel desk and buttoned his jacket. His phone began ringing. The caller identification displayed Aurelius' Air Executive Office. He watched it ring twice before answering. A carefully controlled voice greeted him and began offering apologies, explanations, and immediate transportation to the morning meeting. Marcus walked toward the window and looked at aircraft rising into the pale sky. Then he interrupted gently. Before we discuss the transaction, I need you to answer one question. The voice went silent. Marcus thought of the white passenger who had received patience, Emily who had asked for 2 minutes, and the empty seat that had crossed the country without him. If I were not Marcus Bennett, he asked, would anyone in that room be calling me this morning? The voice on the other end did not answer immediately. Marcus could hear the faint shuffle of papers and the distant murmur of people who had probably gathered around a conference table expecting the problem to be solved with the right apology. Finally, Daniel Price spoke. Mr. Bennett, I cannot honestly answer that question the way you deserve. Marcus looked down at the traffic moving beneath the hotel window. Then do not try. Daniel continued carefully. We want to make this right. We can arrange private transportation to the meeting. We can have an aircraft ready within the hour. No. A car, then. Whatever you need. Marcus closed his laptop. You are still trying to solve the wrong problem. Silence returned. I do not need a better seat, Mr. Price. I needed the seat I already paid for. Daniel exhaled quietly. Understood. No. Marcus said, without raising his voice. Not yet. Across town, the Aurelius leadership team sat beneath cold conference room lights while the suspended transaction remained open on their screens. Lawyers had begun calculating contractual exposure. Finance teams were reviewing contingency plans. Senior executives who had spent months preparing for the closing were suddenly asking how one operational decision had reached the highest level of the company. But Marcus was not interested in panic. Panic could disappear as soon as the money started moving again. "I want an independent review," he said. "Not an internal summary written to protect the company. Preserve the passenger records, gate logs, system timestamps, crew reports, and available video." Daniel glanced toward the general counsel. "We can do that. I also want written protection for every employee who cooperates with the review." Marcus thought of Emily standing near the galley, asking for 2 minutes while everyone else seemed determined to save seconds. Especially the employees who challenged the decision before it became expensive. Daniel understood. "Emily Carter." Marcus paused. "So you already know. We reviewed her initial report this morning. Then you know she tried to prevent this." "Yes." Marcus walked toward the desk and touched the edge of his boarding pass, which he had kept beside the laptop. "Good. Make sure telling the truth does not cost her a career." Daniel agreed. Then came the question everyone at Aurelius wanted answered. What happens to the transaction? Marcus looked at the $52 billion closing documents on his screen. It stays frozen. Several people in the conference room exchanged worried looks. Daniel lowered his voice. "Until when?" "Until I know whether what happened to me was one man's failure or a system that taught him he could make that choice." The words settled across hundreds of miles. Marcus was not threatening to destroy the airline. That would have been simpler. He was asking them to examine something far more uncomfortable than a balance sheet. Daniel finally said, "We will cooperate fully. Then start with seat 2A. After the call ended, Marcus stood alone in the quiet hotel room. His phone continued filling with messages, but he ignored them. At Aurelius headquarters, however, the consequences were only beginning. Investigators opened the passenger records. The timestamps appeared one after another. Marcus's ticket had been valid. The gate agent had cleared the original flag. Emily had warned Richard before Marcus left the aircraft. The final system confirmation had arrived while the boarding door was still open. And then someone pulled the cabin map from Flight 417. Seat 2A had remained empty for the entire journey. Daniel stared at the image on the screen. $52 billion had not stopped because of a computer error. It had stopped because the truth had arrived in time, and someone with authority had chosen not to listen. The independent review began before noon, and by late afternoon the timeline had become impossible to explain away. Every digital record told the same story. Marcus Bennett had boarded with a valid ticket. The temporary verification flag had been caused by an aircraft change. The gate agent had cleared the reservation before boarding. Emily Carter had warned Richard Coleman that the passenger record was still synchronizing. The final confirmation had arrived before the aircraft door closed. Yet Marcus had still been left behind, while seat 2A traveled empty. Richard sat alone in a small conference room at Aurelius headquarters, facing a screen filled with timestamps he could no longer argue with. Across the table, an independent investigator asked him to explain why another passenger affected by the same system problem had been allowed to remain on board. Richard looked down at the printed reports. The circumstances seemed different at the time. What specifically was different? Richard opened his mouth, then stopped. He had spent hours telling himself that schedule pressure had forced a quick decision. But the records showed that the white passenger's problem had been handled patiently before Marcus was approached. They had found time when they believed patience was appropriate. Richard rubbed his hands together beneath the table. "I made a judgment call." "Based on what?" Again, silence. For the first time since the incident, Richard seemed to understand that intention would not erase outcome. He might never have spoken a racial insult. He might never have consciously told himself that Marcus deserved less respect. But when uncertainty appeared, he had given one man the benefit of the doubt and denied it to another. That difference had been visible to everyone except the person making the decision. Several floors above, Daniel Price joined a video conference with Marcus and David Ross. "The preliminary findings support your account," Daniel said. Marcus sat quietly in his office, the city visible through tall windows behind him. "This was never about whether you believed me." Daniel nodded. "I understand." "Do you?" Marcus asked. "Because if I had been a teacher flying home, or a mechanic visiting his family, or a college student who saved for that seat, there would be no $52 billion transaction to freeze. There would only be a complaint number." Daniel looked down. Marcus continued. That is what your review needs to answer. Not why your company mistreated a chief executive officer. Why did your system make it so easy to mistreat a black passenger until his job title made everyone uncomfortable? No one spoke for several seconds. Then Daniel said, "The board wants to meet with you personally. I will meet with them when the review is complete. They are prepared to discuss compensation." Marcus's expression did not change. "Give the refund to a passenger assistance fund." Daniel blinked. "You do not want compensation? I want to know what changes for the next person." That evening, Richard received a copy of Emily's original incident report. He read the final sentence 3 times. The passenger remained cooperative throughout the entire interaction and requested only that his valid reservation be verified. Richard leaned back and closed his eyes. There was no accusation in her words. That made them harder to dismiss. His phone rested beside the report, filled with messages from executives, attorneys, and colleagues. For years, Richard had believed leadership meant making decisions quickly and standing behind them. Now, staring at the empty seat record from Flight 417, he began to understand the danger in that belief. Sometimes leadership meant stopping long enough to discover that the person challenging your decision was right. Across the city, Marcus received the preliminary findings from David. He read them once, closed the file, and looked at the old boarding pass still resting on his desk. He could end the transaction with a signature. He could make Aurelius pay in a language every corporation understood. Instead, he picked up the phone and called David. "Prepare new conditions for the closing." David paused. "So you are not walking away?" Marcus looked at seat 2A printed beneath his name. "Not yet. If they are willing to change when nobody is watching, then maybe something useful can come from what happened when everyone was." The new conditions reached Aurelius Air before sunrise. They contained no demand for a larger ownership stake, no financial penalty, and no private benefit for Marcus. Instead, Bennett Global required an independent passenger treatment audit, mandatory review procedures before removing any ticketed traveler over a disputed reservation, stronger protections for employees who challenged questionable decisions, and quarterly reporting to the board on complaints involving unequal treatment. David read the final page twice before sending it. "You could ask for almost anything right now," he told Marcus. Marcus stood beside his office window, watching morning lights spread between the buildings. "That is exactly why I should be careful what I ask for." By 9 o'clock, the Aurelius board had assembled in an emergency meeting. Marcus joined by video. Richard was not present. The investigation had placed him on administrative leave while the company reviewed his conduct. But Marcus had made one thing clear before the meeting began. He would not participate in turning Richard into a public spectacle. If your solution is to fire one man, issue a statement, and return to business as usual, Marcus said, then keep the transaction frozen. The board chair leaned forward. "What are you asking us to do instead?" Marcus looked directly into the camera. "Find out what made his decision possible." He ignored an employee who had correct information. He treated 2 passengers facing similar problems differently. He chose speed over verification. If your culture rewards those choices, replacing him will not fix anything. Daniel Price placed Marcus's proposed conditions on the conference table. Several directors began reading. One finally asked, "And if we accept all of this? Then we evaluate whether your actions match your signatures." The answer was not what they expected. They had spent the previous day preparing to negotiate with an angry billionaire. Marcus was giving them something harder to negotiate against: accountability. Later that afternoon, Richard requested permission to speak with him. David advised against it. Marcus accepted. The call lasted only a few minutes. Richard appeared on the screen without the controlled confidence he had carried aboard Flight 417. "Mr. Bennett, I owe you an apology." Marcus remained silent. Richard swallowed. "I was under pressure to get the flight out. I made a decision too quickly. You gave the other passenger time." Richard looked down. "Yes." "Why?" The question hung between them. Richard could have blamed the software, the schedule, or incomplete information. Instead, he said quietly, "I do not have an answer that makes me look better." Marcus nodded once. "Then do not look for one." Richard lifted his eyes. "I did not think of myself as someone who would treat a person differently because of race. Most people do not introduce themselves to their own mistakes before making them." Richard absorbed the words. "What happens to me now?" Marcus leaned back slightly. "That is not my decision." Surprise crossed Richard's face. You are not asking them to fire me? I am asking them to hold you accountable. There is a difference. Richard said nothing. Marcus thought about the moment in seat 2A when announcing his identity could have changed everything. That was precisely what still troubled him. You should understand something, Marcus said. The worst part was not that you failed to recognize a chief executive officer. The worst part was that you believed I needed to be someone important before I deserved 2 more minutes. Richard lowered his eyes again. After the call ended, Marcus returned to the window. His phone vibrated with a message from David. Aurelius had accepted every condition in principle. The transaction, however, remained suspended. Marcus was not ready to release $52 billion because a board had learned how to say yes under pressure. He wanted to see what they would do after the fear faded. On his desk, beside the unsigned agreement, lay the boarding pass for seat 2A. The paper no longer represented what had been taken from him. It represented the question now facing an entire company, whether respect would remain after nobody powerful was watching. For the next 3 weeks, Marcus heard almost nothing from Aurelius Air, and that was exactly what he wanted. Public apologies were easy when cameras were watching. Real change happened in conference rooms where nobody received applause for doing the right thing. The independent review continued while Bennett Global kept the transaction suspended. At Aurelius, every disputed passenger removal from the previous 2 years was examined. Patterns began appearing in the records. Most incidents had legitimate operational explanations, but investigators found something harder to measure than policy violations. Employees with lower authority often noticed problems before senior managers did, yet many had learned to remain silent because challenging a supervisor could damage a career. Emily had nearly done the same. One afternoon, Marcus received a confidential update from David. They offered Emily a position on the new passenger review committee, he said. Marcus looked up from his desk. Did she ask for it? No. The independent team recommended her. Good. David continued. Richard's case is more complicated. Marcus waited. The review confirmed unequal treatment and failure to follow verification procedures. The board wants to terminate him. Marcus looked toward the city beyond his office windows. Because of what he did, or because they need someone the public can blame? David was quiet. Probably both. Marcus leaned back. Then the board needs to separate those reasons. You still do not want him fired? I want consequences that make sense. Revenge is not governance. 2 days later, Marcus met privately with the Aurelius board. Richard's employment record was displayed among the review documents. For 17 years, he had received strong performance evaluations. He had also been praised repeatedly for keeping operations moving under pressure. Marcus read one sentence from an old evaluation twice. Richard makes fast decisions and rarely allows frontline disagreement to delay execution. Marcus placed the paper down. There it is. The board chair frowned. What do you mean? You rewarded the exact behavior that failed on flight 417. Nobody answered. Marcus continued. Richard is responsible for his choice. But your company spent years teaching him that speed mattered more than listening downward. Daniel Price slowly nodded. What would accountability look like to you? Marcus looked around the table. That is your responsibility to decide. But if you remove him, do not pretend the problem leaves with him. In the end, Richard was removed from operational authority and required to complete an extended leadership and bias review before the company would consider any future management position. The decision was neither forgiveness nor destruction. It was consequence with a door left open for change. When Richard heard the outcome, he requested one final message be delivered to Marcus. It contained only 2 sentences. I kept thinking I was protecting the schedule. I never asked myself why I gave one passenger patience and another suspicion. Marcus read the message and placed it beside the boarding pass from seat 2A. He did not reply immediately. That evening, he called Emily instead. She answered nervously. Mr. Bennett, I heard about the committee. I almost turned it down. Why? Because I keep thinking I should have spoken louder that night. Marcus looked at the darkening sky outside his window. You spoke when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Emily was silent. That matters, he said. But next time, speak sooner. She gave a small, emotional laugh. I will. After the call, Marcus opened the latest Aurelius reform report. New verification procedures were already being tested at 12 airports. Frontline employees could now pause disputed removals without supervisor retaliation. Independent complaint reviews had begun. None of it guaranteed perfection. Systems were built by people, and people carried blind spots into every rule they wrote. But for the first time since leaving Seat 2A, Marcus saw evidence that the airline was changing before the $52 billion started moving again. He picked up his phone and called David. "Schedule the board review," he said. David paused. "Are you ready to release the closing?" Marcus looked at Richard's message, then at Emily's name on the new committee roster. "I am ready to see if they have earned the chance." The board review took place on a quiet Monday morning, 26 days after Flight 417 left without Marcus. No reporters waited outside. No cameras stood in the conference room. That mattered to him. Aurelius had already released a public statement acknowledging procedural failures, but Marcus had paid more attention to what happened after the headlines faded. Daniel Price opened the meeting with a report covering the 12 airports where the new verification process had been tested. Disputed reservations now required a second review before a passenger could be removed solely because of a system conflict. Frontline employees had authority to request a short operational pause when records disagreed. Complaints involving unequal treatment were reviewed independently instead of disappearing into ordinary customer service queues. Marcus listened without interrupting. "How many employees have used the pause procedure?" he finally asked. Daniel checked the report. 37. "How many were disciplined for delaying operations?" "None." Marcus nodded. "And how many passenger removals were prevented?" 9. The room became quiet. 9 people. Marcus did not know their names, their jobs, or the color of their skin. None of them knew that an empty seat on a rainy night had helped change the procedure that protected them. That was the first number in the entire process that mattered more to him than 52 billion. Emily joined the meeting by video from Chicago. She looked slightly uncomfortable speaking before the board, but her voice remained steady. "The new policy works because employees know they can ask questions without being treated like they are challenging authority," she explained. "Sometimes the system is wrong. Sometimes the passenger is confused. But 2 extra minutes can prevent a decision that cannot be taken back." Marcus remembered her standing near the galley, asking Richard for exactly that. "Thank you, Ms. Carter," he said. Emily smiled faintly. "Thank you for keeping us honest." Marcus shook his head. "You did that first." After she disconnected, the board chair placed the revised closing agreement in front of Marcus. "We have accepted the oversight conditions permanently," she said. "They will remain whether this transaction closes or not." Marcus looked around the table. That was the answer he had been waiting for. Change that depended on his money was leverage. Change that remained without it had a chance to become culture. He picked up the pen but did not sign immediately. "I want one final commitment." Several faces tightened. 6 months from now, Marcus continued, "I want the independent auditors to return without advance notice. If these policies exist only on paper, the agreement gives Bennett Global the right to reopen the governance review." The board chair nodded. "Agreed." Marcus signed. The sound of the pen moving across paper was almost disappointingly small for a decision involving $52 billion. No one applauded. Marcus preferred it that way. Daniel released a breath and closed his folder. "I suppose this is where I thank you for not walking away." Marcus placed the pen down. "Do not thank me yet. Make it worth staying." Later that afternoon, Marcus received another message from Richard. This time, he answered. Richard had written that he was beginning the leadership program and volunteering to participate in the review of the old procedures he once enforced. Marcus replied with one sentence. "Learn from the people you used to interrupt." Then he placed his phone aside. The transaction was moving again, but Marcus felt no victory in the money. The real test would come months later, at some crowded gate, when a tired employee faced a confused passenger and nobody important was watching. If that employee chose patience over assumption, then perhaps Seat 2A had finally carried someone somewhere after all. 6 months later, Marcus Bennett stood at an Aurelius Air gate beneath the same cold white lights he remembered from that rainy evening. This time, morning sunlight filled the terminal windows, turning the polished floor pale gold. He was traveling alone again, carrying the same leather portfolio, wearing another quiet charcoal jacket, and attracting no more attention than any other businessman waiting for a flight. His boarding pass showed Seat 2A. Marcus noticed the number and smiled faintly before placing his phone back in his pocket. Near the gate counter, a young black man in jeans and a college sweatshirt was speaking with an agent. His voice was calm, but worry showed clearly on his face. "I paid for this ticket 3 months ago," he said. "The application still shows my seat." The agent studied her screen. "I see the problem. The aircraft changed this morning, and your reservation has not synchronized correctly." Marcus stopped several feet away. For one brief moment, the scene felt painfully familiar. A supervisor approached. The young man straightened, already preparing himself to defend a purchase he knew was valid. Marcus could have stepped forward. One introduction would have changed the temperature of the entire gate. He did not move. The supervisor looked at the passenger's boarding pass, then at the computer. "Let us verify everything before we make any decision," she said. She turned toward the gate agent. "Use the secondary review process. We can hold boarding for 2 minutes." Marcus felt something inside him become quiet. Nobody at the counter knew who he was. Nobody was performing for the chief executive officer whose company had once frozen a $52 billion transaction. They were simply following a process designed to give a human being the benefit of verification before suspicion. Less than 2 minutes later, the agent smiled. "You are confirmed, sir. I apologize for the confusion." The young man released a breath. "Thank you for checking." "Of course." He walked toward the jet bridge without ever noticing Marcus. That was exactly how Marcus wanted it. "Mr. Bennett?" He turned and found Emily Carter approaching in a dark blue uniform with a small leadership training badge near her name tag. "I thought that was you." Marcus smiled. "You look busy. The new training program started last month. I am helping with the regional sessions now." Marcus glanced toward the gate counter. "I saw." Emily followed his gaze and understood. "That supervisor completed the program 3 weeks ago." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then it is working." "Not perfectly," Emily said. "But better. Better is where change starts." Boarding began a few minutes later. Marcus walked down the jet bridge and entered the aircraft. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and clean fabric. He found seat 2A and placed his portfolio beneath the seat in front of him. Outside the window, sunlight stretched across the runway. As other passengers settled around him, Marcus thought about the first time he had sat there, when a valid ticket had not been enough to protect his dignity. He thought about Richard, now completing his leadership program away from operational authority. He thought about Emily choosing to speak when silence would have been safer. He thought about 9 passengers whose names he would never know and one young man at the gate who had received 2 minutes without needing wealth, influence, or a powerful title. The aircraft door closed. This time, seat 2A was occupied. Marcus fastened his seat belt and looked through the window as the plane began moving toward the runway. $52 billion had started moving again months earlier, but that had never been the real ending. The real ending had happened at the gate, where nobody recognized him, nobody feared him, and a stranger had been treated with dignity anyway. Marcus rested his head against the seat and watched the morning light rise across the glass. Sometimes power was not proving that you could make the world stop. Sometimes it was changing one small corner of it, so the next person would never need your power at all.